I jumped over the side and ran across Highway 101 to the store and bought, besides wine, a little bread and candy. I ran back to my freight train, which had another 15 minutes to wait in the now warm, sunny scene. But it was late afternoon and bound to get cold soon. The little bum was sitting cross-legged at his end before a pitiful repast of 1 can of sardines. I took pity on him and went over and said, "How about a little wine to warm you up? Maybe you might like some bread and cheese with your sardines." Welcome to Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle, and our show today is titled Dharma Edge on the Journey to Solitude. And this reportage will concentrate primarily on a concept that we talk about quite often, but I've noticed that we struggle in coming up with a definition that we all agree upon, and that is the subject of loneliness. To start us off, I thought I would introduce a few of the definitions that I found when putting in the term loneliness into our handy-dandy search engine. One being sadness, because one has no friends or company. And the second definition would be of a place, the quality of being unfrequented and remote, isolation. And my immediate reaction when looking at these two definitions is that we couldn't be farther from mine. The only real point of agreement would be with the word isolation. There was a show that I was part of a few months ago where I brought various people together online and we discussed the subject of loneliness, describing it from our own vantage point. And that was, for me personally, a very enriching experience because, of course, everyone comes with a different meaning to this term and how they relate to it. And I felt that, especially with regards to coming up with a solution, quote unquote, for this affliction that we cannot define, but we've clearly noted that it's become much more prevalent since March of 2020, that I would try to look at the subject from different vantage points. And here are some of the key phrases, apart from isolation, which I'll start the show with, that are clearly worth looking at when trying to define this nebulous term. Gray must be terribly disappointed. He thought it would be grand to have you in the office. You must get down to work sometime, and the longer you leave it, the harder it will be. He puffed at his pipe and looked at her, tenderly smiling so that she could not tell if he was serious or not. Do you know, I've got an idea that I want to do more with my life than sell bonds. All right then, go into a law office or study medicine. Nope, I don't want to do that either. So then what do you want to do? Loaf, he replied calmly. Piece from Razor's Edge, authored by Somerset Maugham. So let's start with the word isolation. And on a meta level, can be considered the most prevalent word to define this term, loneliness. And as mentioned, our situation specifically tied to social distancing made this much more prevalent. But the trend started a lot earlier than that. You could even say that the trend, as we know it today, started about 15 years ago with the invention of social media. Because if we watch the development, there became a stronger and stronger need to draw attention to yourself. And after a while, the buzz or the uniqueness or the wow effect or whatever term you want to use became more and more difficult due to the concopia of different messages that were coming through. And then we became overwhelmed with all the data. So that compelled us all to become even more dominant or louder or more ostentatious perhaps. And one could even argue that the louder we became, the more ostentatious our messages were, the more trivial the actual message was. And this became a very clear trigger response model. Where something trivial is thrown in our direction, and our immediate reaction is, oh, how nice. So that's the pattern. Triviality, how nice. Triviality, how nice. Triviality, how nice. And we continue with triviality. How nice. And all of this babbling creates some sort of feeling on a virtual level that we are in a crowd of people and that we're all having a great time. But then after you take a break and step away from the triviality, how nice, then you realize that you're actually all by yourself. And any relating to any type of this triviality that's being pushed in our direction constantly becomes more and more foreign. And then we had reached the pinnacle. Social media alone. Social media alone. It is just the same with mothers when they have born their children and given them their milk and beauty and strength. They themselves become invisible, and no one asks about them anymore. Journey to the East. Haman Hesed. So the next terms that I would like to share with you could be considered to be a subset of the isolation. But then again, maybe not. First term would be alienation. And here I am speaking from a very personal level, considering myself to be a square peg residing in a round hole world. I have had this feeling for a long time. And the older I get, the more pronounced that feeling develops. Not necessarily in the form of anger or resignation or hopelessness, although a number of people would argue to the contrary on that. I just have come to the conclusion that it is the way it is, and instead of hoping to change that condition, or very possibly to change myself, I have performed 180 degrees and have decided to relish in that square peg state. Some of the thoughts that do go through my head, though, when watching the madness that we are confronted with daily on a very non-personal level, those things that are taking place that we cannot control, that do not directly affect us, but then they do because we allow ourselves to be influenced by these various impulses that are being thrown, shot, bombarded, and we say to ourselves, are they not capable of seeing the meaninglessness of that, of what they're doing, and dribble on about? And the mere thought of describing one's thoughts tied to these unnecessary non-influencers almost generates some criticism in that you are cognitively taking the critical approach. Reminds me of a conversation that I was part of last week where I'm not exactly sure what we were talking about. It was regardless, it was much more serious than one of the participants thought was necessary or perhaps even appropriate. And her response was, "That's pretty heavy for a Tuesday morning," which was, of course, a very clear sign. Don't bother me with this. It's too much of a strain. But regardless, we are bombarded by all these components, and it's almost like a persistent toothache that isn't that bad that you need to go to the dentist, but it's really bothersome and it just does not stop. And of course, being that square peg means that you don't necessarily fit into the identity stereotype, whatever that may be, depending upon where you are. And with those groups that you associate with, tied to work or social strata in some fashion. But being that square peg means that you don't really fit in with that identity. And within that concept that I had referred to somewhat in the beginning of the show, in the ability of actually turning a negative into a positive. Can you declare that square pegness as being your identity? And of course, within an identity, does it necessarily need to be associated with a group? Cannot we have an identity of one that is open to others, but in reality expects no entrance? And it was all mine. Not another human pair of eyes in the world were looking at this immense cyclogrammic universe of matter. I have a tremendous sensation of its dreamlikeness, which never left me all that summer, and in fact grew and grew, especially when I stood on my head to circulate my blood, right on top of the mountain, using a burlap bag for a head mat. And then the mountains looked like little bubbles hanging in the void upside down. In fact, I realized they were upside down, and I was upside down. There was nothing here to hide the fact of gravity holding us up, intact, upside down against a surface globe of Earth in infinite empty space. And suddenly I realized I was truly alone and had nothing to do but feed myself and rest and amuse myself, and nobody could criticize. Dharma Bums, Jack Kerouac. So the alienation is more of an internal feeling that one has. And one can argue that we have the choice of complying to the norms, however absurd they may be, of the group that you are dealing with, either on a micro level or perhaps on a meso community or on a macro level within our society. But there is the influence that is coming from the outside. And here I'm referring to social exclusion. So instead of moving towards the exclusion, why don't we look at the inclusion and some of the manipulation that can take place to trigger some of these feelings. And I'd like to start with a gentleman who existed roughly 100 years ago, perhaps a little bit longer, Frederick Winslow Taylor. He was active in the late 19th century and is seen as being the founder of industrial efficiency. And I'm not really quite sure of where I came up with this information. I was looking prior to the show to see whether I can come up with some direct quotes. And unfortunately, they didn't necessarily appear within the search engine. So I'm going by my recollection of this story. There was an experiment that took place pretty much, it might have been from Taylor, not quite sure, but certainly around the time that Taylor was not just in vogue, but his methods were considered to be standard. There were individuals who were interested in measuring whether sound has an effect on productivity, and here I'm concentrating primarily on an assembly line. So they set up speakers that were not obtrusive so that the individuals who were to be found within this assembly line did not receive any visual triggers. But they started with some sort of sound, and they observed the activity that was taking place on the assembly line to measure whether the sound that was being broadcasted to the employees, whether that was having any effect. And they came to the conclusion that productivity actually increased. They weren't quite sure, and perhaps they were thinking that the sound might even be detrimental. In other words, it would be getting in the way of the activities that the employees were performing within the assembly line, but it actually improved the productivity. So then they thought, oh, isn't that interesting? So they decided to turn up the volume. Yes, they turned up the volume of the sound, and guess what? The productivity increased once again. Now, one can argue that could be a correlation. In other words, we try something out, we see a response, and we assume that we were directly causing that response instead of being a causal relationship. But regardless, one thing was for sure, that we have, by instinct, this need for attention, and will respond to any type of attention, regardless of whether it's positive or negative. And I know of other studies that have been performed that show that even when we are talking about something extremely negative, that individuals will prefer that instead of being ignored. So looking at loneliness from this perspective, the social exclusion for some could be the most painful, because they do not want to be excluded. The individuals who are performing the action are causing great harm. And it can be used as one lethal weapon. And that ostracizing basically takes on the form that, on a very basic level, that you are different. You are different from us. That means you are not part of us. And we will remind you every day of your life. And you can well imagine this is a weapon that is used to keep people in line. I'd like to give you a couple of examples. Recently, I've been going through a number of books tied to a history where I was either alive or perhaps right before I entered the happiest place on earth, with the intention of understanding perhaps some of the impulses I was picking up as a small child, to either better understand them or to see to what degree history has actually changed the way that we view the events that as they were taking place. And this happens quite often. If you look back into newspapers or magazines from a certain period of time, you will realize that the banter that was taking place looks a lot different than it does later on, because history has this way of maybe rounding off the edges, certainly looking at things from a perspective going by the basic premise that the winners are the ones that actually write the history. That playing also a very important role. And at the time that all of this is taking place, we don't know who the winners are. So within that of what was taking place in the United States, starting around 1948, there was a pivot towards anti-communism. And I'm sure that you have heard about the McCarthy hearings and the like. But the gravity of that, of what was really taking place, was not quite apparent to me. And I think for those individuals who were perhaps those square pegs, let's call them socialist square pegs, that they did not have an easy time. No siree. But what I didn't realize was the correlation tied to the question of segregation. Those who were standing by the side of the Afro-Americans the entire time, much earlier than the 1960s. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. They were the communists, because the communists understood that it was a system that was suppressing Afro-Americans. So if we want to have equality within our society, we need to establish a new system. And please don't get me wrong, I am not advocating what was being professed, although I tend to think we, through time, very often we will take up the good and try to negate the not so good. And in fact, looking at it from a Keynesian perspective, if we look at all of the actions that took place within the Western world from the governments, you would think that we are all Keynesians now. And in fact, that was a real eye-opener for a number of us, because we didn't realize this was possible. And those powers will, the powers that be, will truly have difficulties in putting that fiscal cat back into the bag. Regardless, go back to the story. You see within some of the leaders of the Afro-American community at that time, individuals who I consider to be great thinkers, such as Paul Robeson or W.E.B. Du Bois, that they were very much looking at a system change. Let's leave it at that, as a system change. But to make this narrative even worse, we found a tendency within the South of the United States to use that anti-communist card as a weapon against anyone who was trying to alleviate segregation. So what they would do is anytime any individual or a group of individuals would be looking to solve the injustice caused by segregation, they were labeled communists. So when in doubt, pull out the red card. And of course, for those Southerners, this had a double bonus. One, they were able to keep the abolitionists at bay, but they were able to keep the Yankees in line because they knew that the Yanks were never going to fight the Southerners on the subject of anti-communism. Everybody was trying to be more anti-communist than the next one. Just need to look at the 1960 election with John Kennedy. And we have a current example of how that social isolation or the social exclusion is taking place, and that is with our good friend, Roger Putin. But instead of anti-communist, that one doesn't seem to work. And if anything, we turn things around and we perform a big mashup where we bring back the nostalgia of the Soviet Union, plus our nostalgia for the Tsar, plus our nostalgia for the church, and they are wrapped up into one big ball. But the stigma that you will find that has been pronounced since, I think, go back to the time where Putin had to step down as president and made the switch with Medvedev. Around that time, they started with the pedophile peril. And their big claim was that we have to save society from the pedophiles. And of course, within this concept of pedophilia, all of the distrust elements of society were more or less thrown into the same basket, that being homosexuals, the Nazis, those that are demonstrating in any fashion. They were all thrown within the same bucket. And in fact, if you look at propaganda coming out of Russia today, you will see that there are plenty of inferences to this pedophilia danger. In fact, you might even want to try this exercise at home. Go to your favorite search engine, go to a Russian search engine. The most predominant one I could think of would be Yandex. And try some of these phrases. Subversion, Russia, pedophilia, and see what comes out of it. And then if you feel really, really adventurous, you might even want to try subversive, Ukraine, Nazi, and see what kind of responses you will actually come up with. Now, in all fairness, we here in Austria are not immune of any of this propaganda. And here you can pick any old search engine, makes no difference. Try putting these three words into your search engine and see what the results are. Danger, Austria, Afghani terrorist. And I bet you will come up with you will find a clear similarity between all of these terms, and we've created the boogie person, and with that we have labeled them so that we know who the enemy is, and in fact they are to be excluded from our brave new world. It is the law of service. He who wishes to live long must serve, but he who wishes to rule does not live long. Journey to the East, Hermann Hesse. You are listening to Radio Tipping Point, and our show today is titled Dharma Edge on the Journey to Solitude. I'd like to move on to the next grouping, which very possibly, or most probably, is the most predominant one, and this is all tied to despair. So that despair being the root cause and the symptom or the effect being loneliness. And of course we're talking about groups within our society, clearly more than one, and they are not so much in the minority. If we look at the statistics that has come out recently tied to inflation and the ability for Austrian households to cope, according to Der Standard, 1/3 of all Austrians are struggling to make ends meet. So very possibly, or most probably, at least 1/3 of our society could be considered to be part of this category of despair. But the one that we are most aware of are the ones that are staring us in the face. And it would be the homeless, or perhaps the alcoholics or drug addicted. There was a time where we would throw homosexuals into that group. And thank goodness we were able to at least make the despair group a little bit more exclusive. But here in Austria, we have an additional group that we do not talk about. For certain cultures, it will be considered to be almost mind-blowing. But I would throw the individuals who are heavily in debt into this group of despair, because this is something we do not allow to take place here in this country. And one can argue that things have gotten better, but when talking to people, I'm not quite sure. And there's an individual who I've gotten to know a little bit better recently, who very competent individual. And in fact, I'm always impressed not only with his ideas, but his ability to make things happen. And one day, we were traveling back from some event, and he started to tell me a story. Graduated from engineering high school, construction engineering. And to make a longer story short, eventually set up his own company, but became so disgusted with the attitude to be found within the industry, specifically tied to corruption, in the, let's call it, immorality that was expected, that he decided to get out. And at the time that he said no mas, he had debt of, I believe, 30,000 euros. And there was, making this rather simplistic, there are probably other factors involved, but one can clearly denote the lack of collateral, and of course the ability to come up with accommodation like as being almost an impossibility. And in fact, he told me he was homeless for about 3.5 years. And through that, a certain transformation took place where he identified with other individuals within society, primarily within the techno community, and understood the importance of democracy, the importance of freedom in a much more deep-seated way than perhaps some of us in our society would define any of these terms. And the idea of certain things being free, that being knowledge to a certain degree, the whole idea of open source, etc., etc. Although I suspect he's still dealing with his ghost, that is a positive story of an individual who was able to turn things around, coming to a realization that he is empowered to define what the ground rules are for himself. But we know how difficult that is. And we should not consider that to be the standard, and in fact, that there are a number of individuals who do not choose this path, but land in it. And in fact, this idea of social exclusion is a natural reaction that we find ourselves falling into without us ever really being cognitive of the prejudice that's taking place. But that poor little drop of water, when it once more has become one with the sea, has surely lost its individuality. Larry grinned. You want to taste sugar. You don't want to become sugar. What is individuality but the expression of our egoism? Until the soul has shed the last trace of that, it cannot become one with the Absolute. Razor's Edge, Somerset Maugham. And to leave you all with butter on your bread, looking at things from the brighter side of life. There is indeed a silver lining. One that does not happen on its own. One that we continuously need to strive towards. But nevertheless, it is there. And it is the concept of solitude. And I found this to be quite enlightening. Again, preparing for this little diatribe here that you freely decided to engulf yourself with. This is another term that very often has different meanings, although for me it's very much a positive, but for others, not necessarily the same. So if we are going to follow the storyline, maybe to what it can be found within the guidelines of the hero with 1,000 faces, that adversity can actually lead us to the arrival at, let's call it, a higher plane. Where the first step might not necessarily be that concept of self-reliance, which I think was quite prominent in the story that I gave you of this friend of mine. But it certainly could be part of it. Or maybe a step that you might not reach immediately, that you need to follow a number of steps before you can hit that go-to self-enlightenment button. And part of it could very well be based upon a certain level of acceptance. And let me explain to you what I'm referring to here. That we might not always be happy with the way that we act. We might not be happy about a number of things about ourselves. And I would argue this is all quite normal. But the true freedom, my friends, is when we are capable of just accepting it. And acceptance is nothing close to being in agreement or promotion. It's just saying it is this way. And one could argue that personal acceptance is a prerequisite for us accepting the rest. Because if we cannot accept ourselves, we understand that sometimes our tirades have nothing to do with the individual to whom we've set this barrage in motion, but rather it is a reaction towards something that's very internal. Yeah, that acceptance also eventually leads, and perhaps this might be at a higher plane or higher state, that you relish the moment as it is, without any caveats or maybe some preconceived notions about it, the situation you find yourself to be in, or yourself, the way you are. You just accept it, and you try to relish in that of what you have. At this time of the year, one that I love, I know I hear enough people around me complaining about the heat. But for me, this is a wonderful time of the year where the ability to perform different types of activities is simply there. We have the ability to make it happen. We see certain characteristics in nature taking place. It's kind of like a coming out party. In the changes of the weather, in the changes of the behavior which we find within nature, that very often is working at a furious pace. For me, this is simply amazing. And so I love this time of the year. And I might not necessarily always be successful, but I try to incorporate this into my daily ritual, where there's a part of Vienna that locals will know of because it's very often in the news, called the Lobau. And for those non-Viennese listening, this is an area on the Danube where one can find a very strong sense of natural beauty, where there perhaps is less activity. There is still activity, but certainly not as pronounced as maybe other areas along the Danube. Maybe it's a little bit quieter. So, in any case, I really love this area. So I try to make this part of my daily ritual to make it out to this area, the Lobo, every day to go swimming. And there's something that continues to blow my mind every time I am out there, due to traffic and overall congestion, and because of the heat, and because of the quiet. I try to get out there relatively early. And because we all might have a different definition of what early is, let me define mine. That would be around, to be out there by 7 in the morning, sometimes even earlier if the days are very warm, because inevitably it's cooler out there, because all of those trees do create shade. This is not fake news, folks, that trees actually do help us in controlling the heat. And there are plenty of trees out there. And so inevitably it's always a little bit cooler than what we'll have in the office or at home or whatever. So it's nice being out there. But here's the part that truly blows my mind. And this is almost without exception. In a city of 2 million people, I am out there by myself. This beautiful area, so pristine, so giving, so rejoiceful, and of a city of 2 million people, I'm the only person out there. Don't even talk about going out into the water. And here I have to be honest. I truly, truly relish in the solitude of being out there with nothing that gets in the way of me simply remaining in awe of the beautiful scenery that I find myself to be in, and relishing in the moment that I consider daily to be a gift, knowing full well that there's pretty much the vast majority that do not have that luxury. And obviously, there are a number of other people within our society that might have different priorities. So, maybe being a square peg isn't such a bad thing after all, huh? So that would be my definition of solitude. Yes, indeed, folks. And maybe quickly talk about the impetus of this show. It started a long time ago. It's perhaps a bit exaggerated, but I started reading the book that I quoted today, The Dharma Bums from Jack Kerouac, thinking that this is probably something that you should pick up on sometime. And it blew my mind. This one really blew my mind, that Kerouac was able to talk about things, conditions that we still find today very prominent, and him relishing in the solitude. And it's not anti-people. It is pro yourself and pro your experience, and knowing full well for us to be much more in tune of society, we need to be in tune with ourselves. And for me, that was clearly the message. And it reminded me of the book The Razor's Edge from Somerset Maugham, where the character Larry decides to test himself. That was my feeling when I first stumbled across it roughly about 40 years ago. And I found a common thread between the two, and all of a sudden being confronted with the subject of loneliness on the one side and the other being solitude, although that was more of a conclusion. I was not aware of what those things were bringing these two books together for me. And I felt that was something that is worth sharing. And so that was the impetus of the show. And I think if there is something that I could wish for all of you, is the ability to strive towards that solitude, knowing full well that within that self-acceptance, that a number of the ills to be found within our society have a chance of being cured. And perhaps it's easier to accept others. And maybe it's easier to treat others with respect. With that, I'll leave you and wish you a very pleasant rest of the week.